The following podcast is a deep, shallow dive production.
And you're going to love it.
Okay, let's go.
All right, so basically, as I was telling you before I hit record, there's 4 or 5 guys I go to when I need real information, and that is Scott Horton, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Professor John Mearsheimer. Let's see, Tucker Carlson. I like to listen to him. Your buddy Daryl Cooper's fantastic, and then trying to think who else. Man, that's like the top of my list. Maybe a little Candace Owens scattered in as well. And that's actually how I discovered you. So, hey, listen, everybody, we got a real treat for me today and a real treat for everybody today. But Scott Horton is somebody that, you know, if you are on Instagram and if you are on Facebook, you've probably seen him and heard him and probably thought, man, this guy really knows what he's talking about. So, hey, welcome to the Deep Shallow Dive. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Ray, for having me. Good to be with you.
Good stuff. All right, listen, I want to start off with getting into I actually want to start off with talking about, you know, your new book, which is called Provoked. And then I know you and Daryl have launched a new podcast with the same name. So that's great branding. But it really kind of, you know, touches on one of the things that I think, you know, people just need to understand the truth on, and that is Russia, Ukraine. And so, you know, I've learned a lot about the situation about Russia, Ukraine, and not that it basically started, you know, when was that? 2022, and, you know, the Biden administration created the marketing slogan of, you know, Putin's brutal invasion. That's when I was like, wait a minute, is this really the truth? And then I started listening to you. I started listening to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, all these guys. And I realized, you know, the history of this thing, you know, goes back probably a long way. But what I'd love for you to do is, you know, maybe we start with the Cold War and the ending of the Cold War, because in my opinion, when the Cold War ended, the US and NATO, they needed another enemy. They needed another boogeyman, you know, a big bad wolf. And I feel like it went from the Cold War to the bearded war. And then that's when the war on terror started. So maybe we start off talking a little Provoked, talking a little Russia, Ukraine, and then move into kind of, you know, the Middle East stuff.
Sure. And, you know, it's funny, like if I had been crazy enough, I could have made Provoked and then the book before that, Enough Already, which is my book on the Middle East and the terror wars. It could have been all one book. Yeah. If I had, you know, interlaced all the chapters in there and some kind of algorithm or whatever would have made sense, because it really is telling one story about the later days of the Cold War and the aftermath of the Cold War and how how Washington and the foreign policy establishment decided to handle the new era. And, you know, the sensible people were there, but they were just drowned out. So, you know, first of all, you have people like Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan and others who said, okay, the Cold War is over. It's time to come home and be non-interventionists now and, you know, worry about our own problems. And famously, even the neoconservatives, Jeane Kirkpatrick, who had been Reagan's second ambassador to the UN and who had come from the Trotskyite left with the rest of the neocons and wrote for commentary and all those guys. She said in 1990, before the Soviet Union was even all the way gone, she said, you know, now that the Cold War is over, we can come home from Europe, come home from Asia and the Middle East and just be a normal country in a normal time. The entire kind of basis, the argument for building the American superpower, the global empire, was to contain the commie threat, to prevent the Reds from conquering the world. That was what they said. So now that the Soviet Union is falling apart and the Cold War with the communists is over, now we don't have to do this anymore. Except the problem is, of course, all the people who wanted to do this anymore, who didn't feel like they were being made to, but this is what they wanted to do, was, for one, sell big ticket weapons systems to the Pentagon, or maybe one wanted to buy big ticket weapon systems for the Pentagon, 2 wanted to sell them, 3 wanted to get reelected on campaign cash from connected businesses who get their money directly from the Treasury. You know, it's a simple problem of organized power versus the unorganized, right? The people of the country want their peace dividend, but Lockheed doesn't want to have to get a real job. They are government contractors. And so they need to find a way to keep America militarized so that they can keep their budget flowing and their captive market buying. So that was the game. And of course, they can afford the lobbyists. The people out here in the country don't have lobbyists to protect us from their kind of predation. So it really is a matter of democracy not having anything to do with rights or anything like that, but more about democracy just as a faction fight for who gets the spoils, right? And there are people who are willing to fight like hell to keep the system the way it is, the way it was, so that they can keep going to the bank. It's as simple as that. Well, I shouldn't say it's as simple as that.
Start
Part
with
of it is.
Eisenhower. Did like the whole military industrial complex, Eisenhower comes, he gives his goodbye speech of warning us about the military industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
And I feel like Kennedy, JFK kind of took that to heart and really maybe was starting down that path of trying to disband this military industrial complex. And so then it's like, did the military industrial complex take out JFK? Did David Ben-Gurion, Israel, proliferation of their nuclear program, not having to register as a foreign agent? Did they and Mossad take out JFK? Was it a combination? It definitely wasn't Oswald, but like when you say Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and these guys, I mean, this is like a legit thing that's been around 60 years and they've just been profiting like crazy off of war and death.
Yeah. Well, I really don't know who killed Jack Kennedy. I think, to me, Kennedy was really the Barack Obama of his day. And so, like, if somebody had killed Obama, they would have invented all these legends about how great he was and how the only reason he got killed was because of his heroism, whatever, where, like, a lot of that is retconning the story. You know what I mean?
Right?
I think it is possible that it was the Israelis. I mean, they certainly had motive to do it. And for that matter, there were militarists in the Pentagon who wanted to expand in Vietnam, who maybe thought that he was dragging his feet there. I think all the stuff about how he wanted to end Vietnam and really put an end to the Cold War entirely in a second term are probably overstated. However, even I think Eisenhower thought he could end the Cold War before Kennedy even came to town, and his last big summit with Khrushchev was canceled over the shoot down of Gary Powers in the U-2 flight, which may have been deliberate sabotage. He had ordered an end to all flights, and then that plane got shot down and Khrushchev canceled the summit. But essentially, Eisenhower, like they say, only Nixon can go to China. Eisenhower was in the position as five-star tough guy, Republican, two-term president, that he could have gone over there and made a deal with Khrushchev and said, okay, here are our spheres of influence and et cetera like that. Stalin's dead. Let's turn over a new leaf. Yeah. Instead, he did not do that. And then Kennedy and especially Johnson ran on a rapid military expansion. I mean, and Eisenhower had started the massive buildup of nuclear missiles, which Kennedy and Johnson continued. And it wasn't really till Nixon that they started putting a lid on that when we were at like 40,000 missiles. So, and that was especially Johnson, I guess, that did the worst of that buildup. Anyway, so this is the story, right? And I'm glad you mentioned Eisenhower. For people who aren't too familiar with this, and what the hell, there are people who were born not long ago to me who are adults now, right? Who might be very new at this. Ike Eisenhower was the supreme allied commander of NATO forces in Europe. He was a 5-star U.S. Army general. For the West's part, he was in charge of American, British, and then ultimately French forces and whatever allied forces fighting in Western Europe in World War II. And then came home and was the 2-term Republican president of the United States after Truman. And then, as you say, on his last day in office, he gave a speech called "Too Little, Too Late. Good luck, everybody. I don't know what the hell you're going to do, but I built this massive, monstrous military machine, and I can't wrestle it. I can't stop it. And I'm the baddest man on the continent. Good luck, you guys." And he had even said before, I really fear for any president who doesn't know the military like I do and can't control them like I do. And like, quite frankly, the position that he was in, it took every bit of what he had as political capital and strength to tell the army, no, I already gave you more divisions, but I'm not giving you even more than that. I'm giving missiles to the Air Force instead. Pipe down, right? But it took everything he had when they just wanted to endlessly militarize and conscript and build up their legions. And so, this was his new look policy was, no, we're just going to make nuclear missiles instead. That was his idea of getting control of the military industrial complex. The army wants an endless infantry. Instead, we're going to build missiles and bombers, this kind of thing. So, so that's the complex. He built it. And then he warned us that this is the situation he was leaving us in, and good luck to us. He hopes we can solve it. And then, of course, we never did. That's the whole point here is when the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union's military industrial complex helped break their entire system, and it all fell apart at the end of the 80s. The Americans kept their empire. They refused to come home. And then, there were great heroes like Chalmers Johnson who had believed in the Cold War the whole time and had been, a right-wing Cold Warrior professor at USC and a contract analyst with the CIA for many years, who believed in it the whole time until it was over and the empire didn't come home. And then he was like, wait a minute. And he went back and he looked and he could see all the times where we really had off-ramps where we could have ended the Cold War years earlier, even with the Soviet Union still existing, by
Is he the one that
neutralizing its threat.
Did he write Blowback?
Yes, and also Sorrows of Empire, and then Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic, which are just all three fantastic books. And Blowback he wrote before September 11th, warning about just exactly that kind of consequence from American policy.
Got it. Yeah,
Anyway,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, well, I was just gonna say, because I'm taking the long way around trying to answer your question here, but essentially what it is this, man, that they took the opportunity to wage Iraq War I when they could have negotiated Saddam's exit from Kuwait. But once it was on and they decided we're doing this, there was no way to talk them out of it. They were definitely going to war. And then in the aftermath of that was when they inaugurated what's called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which was the defense planning guidance from 1992. It sounds, wonky and boring, but essentially Zalmay Khalilzad and Scooter Libby, working under Paul Wolfowitz, wrote this doctrine that said essentially the New World Order, as H.W. Bush called it.
In ending the long era of conflict and Cold War. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
Would mean an era of unchallenged American supremacy. This is essentially, as Charles Krauthammer later put it, this is our unipolar moment. I guess he had earlier put it that way. This is our unipolar moment. The Soviet Union is out of the way. China is still broke. It's going to be another generation before they're rich and can do anything. All the European powers are weak and are our friends. Japan is our friend. So America dominates the world and there's nobody to stop us. And so, as Krauthammer put it again, we should seek nothing less than universal domination.
Yeah.
As Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol put it, they said, euphemistically, we're erecting a system of benevolent global hegemony. In other words, if anybody but us did it, it would be an evil empire. If the Germans did it, if the Russians did it, if the Chinese did it, if anyone else tried to build the influence we're building, it would be for their evil, greedy self-interest. But in our case, much like the British, all we're doing is we're trying to spread bicameral legislatures and independent judiciaries and democracy and freedom and capitalism to the world. And so it's all very selfless. And when the antiwar.com boys argue that none of this is in our national interest, we say, yes, that's right. This is all so selfless. And we're doing this just for the good of the world. We're creating the liberal, rules-based world order of peace and cooperation and global governance and all of these things, all these kind of buzzwords, which, really have a lot to do with just helping Washington rationalize their imperial project. That there really is, if this was an empire, we wouldn't be doing it, but it's not. So we can. And then they do empire things, and they take advantage the whole time. They know that they're getting kickbacks. They know that they're getting a job at Raytheon when they retire. They know that, But then they just rationalize that part of it away. That's not why we're doing what we're doing, but hey, everybody's got to make a living, or what, you know what I mean? When that is a lot of why they're doing what they're doing. And it also is, as I mentioned there, about if it wasn't us, it would be someone else. You hear this all the time, and including from powerful people, that they really do believe that. And I would just submit to you that that's completely stupid. And I don't know, I just turned 49. So I remember at the end of the first Cold War, when all the talk on TV and in the halls of power in Washington and everything, among all the serious people on the Sunday morning news shows, are Germany and Japan going to rise again and take over the world now? No, right? Like how have Germany and Japan behaved for the last 30 years, right? 35 years. They have no interest in creating, recreating their empires in their regions or that. And not just because America's keeping them down, but just because those eras are over. That's just bad business. They have too much trade to do with everybody else, and they don't need a forceful empire, right? Japan's greater co-prosperity sphere enforced at gunpoint. They don't need one of those to have trade with their neighbors in Eastern Asia now. And the same thing for Germany. So it's not just that America's doing it instead. It's that everybody can just make a trade pact. The era of the 20th century totalitarians is over. Right.
So, yep.
And
was it really that group of guys? Like I always think George H. Bush, Papa Bush, I feel like he was the head of let's call it the head of the snake. Like, was Reagan a neocon? Was Reagan
No.
part of that project?
Reagan was just a con.
Okay.
So H.W. Bush is what you would consider in his era to be a Rockefeller Republican, a centrist liberal Republican, right? So Reagan was a click or two to his right, even though he had been a New Deal guy himself. So like, in a way, literally, like in the most literal sense, he was a neocon, but he wasn't one of that group, right? The neocons is really a biographical definition, meaning friends of Kristol and Podhoretz, these guys who came from the left.
Okay.
Most of them Trotskyites. And then there were a few different avenues that they took to the right, including through Max Schachmann's Social Democrats USA and Young People's Socialist League. And then you had Leo Strauss and Albert Wohlstetter, who were professors at the University of Chicago, who were both former Trotskyites. And then you had the whole staff of the National Review and Commentary Magazine, who had come from the left as well. And then they all started moving right in reaction to the new left kind of hippie movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement of the late 60s, who also sided against Israel in the 67 war, and also all the civil rights stuff and affirmative action and all that, where they thought that the Great Society was overreaching on the left on domestic stuff. So that was when they started moving to the right. But, Irving Kristol wrote a book called 2 Cheers for Capitalism, which I think that really tells you exactly where these guys are. In other words, they move from the Trotskyite left to one hair to the right of center. And people would sometimes mistakenly think of them as far right wingers. You'll hear neoconservatives call that just because they're such hardcore militarists. But that doesn't really make them actual hardcore nationalists, right? They're not that far to the right. They're actually, mildly against affirmative action and mildly against the civil rights overreach of the Great Society era, but not totally. They would not be as right wing as Ronald Reagan on domestic policy. And even he was not all he was cracked up to be when it comes to that stuff. But you would consider them like George W. Bush, compassionate, conservative, very pro Medicare expansion type Republicans, right? They're not. So they're ideologues and they're militarists, but their ideology is really just all about Israel and about American imperialism overall and the beneficence of American hegemony in the world.
So that group, even back then, was really Israel centered.
Yes.
Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Connie Rice, even that whole group. Go ahead.
Now to be specific, right? So Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Rice, Powell, those are not neoconservatives, right? So these guys are their own. W. Bush is just the son of his father, who was more conservative than his father. You consider him more of a conservative Republican than his father, more of like a Reaganite type, but just by a click, right? Like I would consider him to be Ted Kennedy only in the Republican Party, but essentially he called himself a compassionate conservative. In other words, very pro-welfare state, not too far to the right, no child left behind, all that crap, right? Now, Cheney was sort of a conservative nationalist. He had been in the Congress and he was from out west and was connected to oil companies and this kind of thing. So he was, kind of an American, just conservative nationalist type. Rumsfeld had been his mentor back in the Ford years, and Cheney, his inferior. And they had a split when Rumsfeld ran for president in 88 and Cheney supported H.W. Bush instead of Rumsfeld. And so they had a divide and then came back together. But Rumsfeld, he was just like a wet finger in the wind. He had asked his friends, should I be a centrist or a conservative? Like, in other words, like, what's good for my political career was all his thing. You know what I mean? That was all he ever cared about. But you could just take him as a cookie cutter conservative Republican, not too conservative, not too ideological, and very connected to big business in many ways. The neocons, on the other hand, in the W. Bush administration, were people like Stephen Hadley and Robert Joseph, Zalmay Khalilzad, Scooter Libby, John Hanna. And then, in the Pentagon, you had Paul Wolfowitz, Gene Kirkpatrick, Kenneth Edelman, James Woolsey, who had been Bill Clinton's CIA director, was one. And then, of course, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Abram Shulsky, Michael Maloof, and Michael Rubin, and Michael Makovsky, and all of these guys who were brought in, Michael Ledeen, a lot of them named Michael, who were brought into the Pentagon. David Wormser, of course, is a very important one. He had penned the clean break doctrine with Richard Pearl in the 1990s for Netanyahu. And so now John Bolton is worth bringing up because he's often confused for a neoconservative. He's very close to them. And is easily mistaken for one, but he was never a leftist. He was just a lifelong kind of Barry Goldwater conservative Republican and then fit in very well with them, right? Ran around with them, just like Newt Gingrich ran around with them, the former House Speaker. He was like sort of like adjacent to their set.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But this is a very specific group of guys.
So many of those names you mentioned, man, those aren't even names that many people know. I think when people think neocons, they think Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, those guys. But it reminds me of like Henry Kissinger.
Well, like Wolfowitz definitely counts.
Okay, yeah, Wolfowitz counts. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Kissinger, no. So
okay.
Kissinger, you could call him, he's a Jewish conservative American militarist, but he was never a commie. He doesn't come from that group. He favored, in the Nixon years, he was the guy who coined the détente policy that said, let's cool off relations with the Soviet Union and have peaceful coexistence. The neocons hated that. They are way ideological, and they worked with the conservative right to undermine détente. They had launched a thing in the 70s called Team B, which was their own kind of separate freelance CIA investigation of Soviet military technology, and which was hilarious. And said that, oh, you know what? They have this entire fleet of super silent secret submarines that are all over the world right now. And the more we can't find any, the more we know they're there, which was totally made up stuff, this kind of thing. They're overestimating Soviet military capability.
Was Kissinger as evil as he's made out to be? Or I know he was incredibly smart, but he really was evil, huh?
Well, sure. Yeah. The difference between Kissinger and the neoconservatives is just a matter of their particular opinions over the way America should approach particular issues. I think what's funny to me, going through the Iraq War 25 years ago when we had all these arguments then, which Kissinger did end up supporting both Iraq wars. So damn him for that. But the joke at the time was that the neoconservatives hated Kissinger. Kissinger and Brzezinski both. They're the Rockefeller guys. And Brzezinski was to the right of Kissinger, even on the Soviet Union a little bit. But they were basically, Henry Kissinger was Nelson Rockefeller's guy, and Zbigniew Brzezinski was David Rockefeller's guy, his younger brother, right? One the Republican, the other the Democrat. Brzezinski was the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter after Kissinger left with Ford, right? Are you kidding? So this is their policy. And what's their interest? Their interest is Amoco, right? Their interest is Saudi oil. And at that time, Iranian oil was what they cared about. And they are the kind of the progenitors of the realist school of foreign policy, which respects great power politics. And now Mearsheimer is from that same group, although he's not a horrible guy, but essentially, it's what they call realpolitik or realpolitik, meaning understanding that great powers act in their own interest in the international system because there is no world government and is an anarchic world system. And people will follow the law as much as they feel like, and then otherwise they won't. And so then in that case, balance of power politics become very important. So for example, in the recent past, Kissinger was saying, hey, man, you guys are going to miss Russia when it's gone. Russia has played an important role balancing against Germany for the last 500 years. And we got to be careful about just destroying the place because you don't know exactly how things are going to shape up without them. That's like the way that Henry Kissinger thinks. Now, and Kissinger was the type who, before they really pressured him, he would have said, Saddam Hussein's better than probably whatever chaos is going to replace him. You know what I mean? We should probably leave him in power. The neocons said, you horrible, amoral man with your amoral realpolitik foreign policy. We are moralists. We say you must start wars against all the evildoers, right? Making them, of course, the most evil force on the planet by far. But in the name of selflessness and morality, a morality-based foreign policy, instead of the amorality of Henry Kissinger, the scientician, right, with his grand strategy who denies humanity, right? And they say, no, in the name of humanity, we must overthrow the world.
Yeah, exactly. Give me your thoughts on, guys like Saddam, Gaddafi. I mean, one of the clips that, man, it's just gone crazy is that clip of General Wesley Clark when he was at, I think, the Pentagon in 2007, and he's like talking about the 7 countries in 5 years and all that. I mean, it really feels like when I looked at Saddam, when I looked at Gaddafi, prior to digging into this stuff, I always thought, oh, these guys are just awful human beings. And then you look into them and you realize they really, I mean, I'm sure they had bad parts to them. Same thing with like Bashar al-Assad in Syria. But like, man, they really were painted to be something different than I feel like they truly are. Was it all about oil? Was it all about needing an enemy for the military industrial complex? What are your thoughts on Saddam, on Gaddafi, on Assad, the situation in Syria? Because I know you know a lot about them.
Well, look, I think Gaddafi was probably the least worst of the three. Okay. Although even, Assad was an ophthalmologist in London when his older brother died in a car wreck. His older brother was supposed to be the dictator, not him. And so it doesn't mean he was a great leader, but it's not like he was just raised that way. Saddam Hussein really was a ruthless, horrible guy, who raised his sons to be torturers and future dictators and taken power in a bloody coup d'etat at the time, back in 79. And fought the war against Iran ruthlessly with American purchased and German supplied chemical weapons and even biological weapons. And I don't know if he actually used them, but he certainly developed them. So he was horrible. At the same time, though, like implied in your question, was he a threat to his neighbors? Was he an aggressive, threat? And the thing is, they would cite his invasion of Iran and Kuwait, but America gave him the green light to invade Iran, and they gave him like a flashing yellow light to invade Kuwait. He came to America and asked permission in both cases. So, and in the case of Kuwait, it was really a divided response. I don't think they trapped him into it deliberately, but in effect they did. They told the Kuwaitis to be intransigent, and then they told Saddam, you don't have to take that from them. And then they told him, wait, don't. But then it was kind of too late. So they had given him, basically flashing the yellow light. Hey, we're not interested in your border dispute with Kuwait. And even after he originally invaded, they were going to let him get away with it. Just draw the line at Saudi Arabia. So they built up this threat in order to launch the war. They said he's Hitler. He's going to consolidate control over the oil supplies of the Middle East. Next thing you know, he'll be marching on Paris, right? So which was just completely crazy. But then once you call the guy Hitler, well, now you can't compromise with him because he's Hitler. And so would you compromise with Hitler? Remember what Neville Chamberlain and his failure at Munich and blah, blah, blah. So now they just had to they talked themselves and the Israelis talked them into keeping this Cold War policy against Iraq all for the rest of the 20th century, all through the 90s and the rest of the century leading up into the W. Bush years, which is totally unnecessary. They could have normalized relations with Iraq back then.
Yeah.
It's the same situation with Iran and the Ayatollah. Would you want to be sexy, liberal young woman from Tehran in Iran right now? No, but you're not one. And so do you care? No, right? Like, is the Ayatollah really a threat to the United States in any way? Of course not. They're rivals for power in the region, but why is America power in the region in the first place? We don't need to be there at all. As even bin Laden himself had joked that, what am I going to do with this oil? Drink it? It has to be for sale anyway, right? Even if the head terrorist was in charge of it all, it's still got to be for sale. We really don't have to be there. And I I have to tell you, it's not really fair to say, well, what's it all about? Is it all about the oil or all about the weapons? You know, because what it is it's a vast conspiracy of interest, right? You have a bunch of government job holders. You have the military industrial complex. You do have oil interests, although mostly the American oil companies don't care who's in charge, man. They want stability and to just pump the oil.
Right.
Um, and then you have the Israelis, and, you know, the Israelis have their own agenda. And
Yeah.
it includes, you know, compiling and exercising a vast amount of influence in the United States. You asked about the neoconservative movement and have they always been so much about Israel? And the answer is yeah. You know, there just happens to be a huge overlap with Zionism and, you know, this movement of former Trotskyites. Part of why they moved right, as I said, was in reaction to the new left's reaction against Israel in the 67 war. And they said, well, screw that. We're throwing in with the Republicans full scale here. And, you know, previous generation them had been writing for the National Review and had already moved to the right, you know, years before. But there's like, you know, first, second, and third generation neocons all kind of making this pilgrimage from the Trotskyite left to the militarist right during that time. And this is a big part of it. And so now, Andrew Coburn is this great journalist, his brother Patrick Coburn as well. And Andrew talks about how in 1970s, what happened essentially was, you know, this is kind of unheard of these days, but it did exist still then. There were like no Jews allowed at certain country clubs and in certain business, you know, areas and whatever. And it was maybe sort of the last gasp of that during that era. But like the Council on Foreign Relations, there were some Jews there and some Catholics. But for the most part, the Council on Foreign Relations was a very Brooks Brothers WASPy kind of a thing with, you know, a bunch of Episcopalians and very high WASPy social class folk like that ran it. It had been created by the Morgans and then had fallen under the control of the Rockefellers, and who were, for their era, they were kind of new money, but they were, you know, basically the population of the place were very much Harvard and Yale and Princeton folk, you know. And so there was, you know, this whole era. The neoconservatives were only one example of this, but this was happening all over the place where you had middle class people who could afford to go to college and were intellectuals and wanted to participate in politics who didn't fit into those social classes and really weren't welcome. And in the neoconservative movement, you know, many of them were Jews and some of them were Catholics. There were a couple Presbyterians involved, but mostly, you know, who was ever a group of Trotskyites, right? They came from Brooklyn. Like that was the kind of people who ever were, you know, Trotskyoids in the first place to ever have to move to the right from there.
Yeah.
So, but they could only make so much progress inside the Council on Foreign Relations, which, as I said, represented really Rockefeller power at that time, and which was, you know, in other words, oil and banking, right? Standard Oil and Citigroup and Chase, right? What became Citigroup was then National City Bank and Chase Manhattan Bank. And so those are two of the biggest banks in the country, both Rockefeller banks, and then all their huge oil interests over there. So then these neoconservatives, they wanted to have their say. They didn't have any money, right?
Yeah.
They're just middle-class guys. So they made their mob alliance with the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex needs money from the Treasury. They also needed eggheads to write the studies to justify what it is that they're doing and why. And so that's oversimplifying it. But essentially, if oil and banking had the CFR, the MIC needed the neocons. And so that's where then the neoconservatives, with especially Lockheed dollars, they founded the Weekly Standard. They infiltrated, you know, pre-standing foundations like the Olin and Scaife and Mellon foundations, and then took over at Heritage, Hoover, and the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. And then they also set up all of their own think tanks, such as the Project for New American Century, the Committee on the Present Danger, the Center for Security Policy, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and 100 more later, the Foreign Policy Initiative, and all of these. And so, and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs is another important one. When I went through that list of all those neoconservatives in the W. Bush administration, these are the guys that Colin Powell said. They set up a separate government inside the government under the control of the vice president, Dick Cheney. And this neocon network, he called them the Ginsa crowd. And he said they were this separate government. And when he says it, he's talking about David Wormser and Michael Maloof and their buddies, right? The neoconservatives, and how, and so Powell, you know, for people who are too young to remember, this is why anybody voted for W. Bush, was they said, well, Colin Powell's going to be up there driving the car and it's going to be okay. But no, Colin Powell was marginalized from the very beginning. Dick Cheney is actually the
That guy was driving the car, right? Cheney was driving the car.
That's right.
So, everybody we've talked about has kind of been conservative Republican. So where do the Clintons fit into this? Where do even the Obamas, the Bidens, like the powerful Democrats, where do they fit in? Is it really a uniparty? Are they part of this entity? They just don't, they don't claim it?
Well, so the thing is, like, when I talk about how these guys were Trotskyites, a lot of them, on their way to the Republican Party were Cold War Democrats. And in fact, there was a Democrat senator from Washington State named Scoop Jackson. They called him the senator from Boeing. And a bunch of these guys, Wolfowitz and Pearl and Khalilzad and Libby, had all worked for him for a while in the 70s. So that was like sort of the halfway house as they were moving to the right. But so in a way, why were they such bad Republicans? Because they were Cold War Democrats. They were Harry Truman, nuke 'em all guys, was a big part of it. And see, because they were Trotskyites, they hated the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was Stalinist, right? And they were Americans. So might as well side with America in the Cold War. And then on the right, you have people there were too many people on the right who were skeptical of militarism. But the neocons weren't. So the Cold Warriors brought in the neocons to be the vanguard of the conservative right, supposedly, in waging the Cold War. That was how they got all those great jobs at the National Review, as long as they would be hawks. And any conservative wouldn't toe the line on the Cold War was kicked to the curb.
Okay.
Now, so the Democrats themselves, they always sucked, right? And they have a thing. Now, I don't want anybody to get me wrong here. I'm a libertarian. I'm a pure gold, guns, and property rights, free market guy. If humanity's going to survive, it's free markets is the only way to go. Okay. Forget about that. Anybody who says anything otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. So that's purely my take. Just so you understand when I say that. Leftists have really idiotic agriculture policies and lots of other things that they think, but they can be hardcore anti-war. And a lot of times that'll be because they see through the militarist project because of what leftists they are, and maybe to a fault, but with a great degree of accuracy. They see the machinations of the military-industrial complex. They see just what we've been talking about this whole time, this rent-seeking cronyism. Keep America at war so we can keep selling weapons, right? Where the cart is before the horse. And this is not how we're supposed to do it. And, the old saying from Malcolm X that if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. Well, I like to say if you stand for anything, you'll notice that some things aren't right. You know what I mean? Even if you're all wrong, if you have some kind of consistent point of view, then you're going to notice all of the crazy stuff going on around you that really doesn't fit in with the system the way that they had described it to you before. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So you have a lot of criticism of the warfare state from the left. But then what does that mean for a liberal Democrat? That means you don't want to be caught dead sounding like them because they're anti-American communist leftists. And
Right.
So how do you prove that you're not? You prove that you're not by being an avowedly corrupt, corporatist, cronyist, militarist, imperialist. You prove you're not a commie by being Bill Clinton, right?
Yeah.
And so when W. Bush wants to go to war, you see all the center-left liberal Democrats all climb on board to prove what lefties they're not. Right? They call this hippie punching, right? They go, oh, those hippies are against the war, but not me. I'm a good, loyal American flag waving militarist. Hoorah, let's go to war. Which is funny because this is one of the only reasons if you ask a regular guy or gal out there in the world, maybe this is too outdated from a previous era, but this is true up until recent past anyway. If you ask somebody why to prefer a Democrat at all, it would be because maybe they're less militarist. People would think of people like George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and John McCain and Mitt Romney and say, well, we want the opposite of that. We want somebody who's more intellectual, more understanding, and not so quick to go to war. But then listen to just think in your own medium-term memory here about how this works, how these incentives play out in Democratic politics. What do you get? You get nothing but hawks. You get Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and John Kerry and Barack Obama saying, don't you call me a wimp. Look at my muscular foreign policy. Oh, I'm tough. Don't you say that you'd vote for me because I would be more intellectual and softer and more understanding and seek alternatives to fighting, because that sounds like just being a wimp. And that sounds maybe like being a leftist, anti-American communist. And so forget that. And so they called this in the Clinton campaign in 92. It was his Sister Soldier moment, was what they call this, because there was this woman who became, for a very short time, she was part of Public Enemy. And she had made a statement that, like, what's up with black people killing each other all the time? Why don't you kill some white people for a change, or something stupid like that? It was a stupid thing to say, but it was like, whatever. She was like a 21-year-old girl. Like, who cares what she says about anything anyway, right? And Bill Clinton comes out and goes, yeah, well, I disagree with that sister soldier. Why? She's just terrible. Vote Bill. I'm just one hair left of center. You can trust me, right? And then, so like, that's their whole shtick. That's their whole thing. Why is Hillary Clinton? And see, Hillary Clinton lost to Barack Obama because she was such a militarist, right? And then so did John McCain, right? And then Barack Obama hires her to be a Secretary of State. And the first thing she does is monger the surge in Afghanistan. You have to triple the war. You have to listen to the generals. You have to listen to the Secretary of Defense. If they want to escalate the war, you have to escalate the war. Her job was to give him some running room. She's Secretary of State. She's supposed to say, well, geez, I don't know, Mr. President. What if you negotiated and made it? No, she's saying you got to double down, triple the war. Then the next thing she does is essentially strong arm Obama and force him into launching the war in Libya. And why? We know why she did it. She did it for herself. She did it so that she could run on the war in Libya in 2016, and that she could say, unlike stupid W. Bush, I know how to do it right. I launched this war and everything turned out great. Now, of course, everything didn't turn out great. It turned into a horrible civil war. You had ISIS and Al-Qaeda suicide bombers and head choppers running around everywhere, and they re-legalized chattel slavery of black Africans, of sub-Saharan Africans there. So by 2016, she shut the hell up about it and didn't want to say it. But we know why she launched the war. She launched the war so that she could run as a man, essentially, right? Like that, in her conception, she doesn't want to be accused of being feminine, which equates to weak. And because Americans won't tolerate a weak leader. So she's going to be a woman. She's got to be the toughest woman on the block. Look at my muscular foreign policy, she would say. And even when she campaigned in 16, she ran around with Robert Kagan, just the way that Kamala Harris was running around with Elizabeth Cheney. Right? And saying, look at me. I'm muscular. I'm tough. I'm a militarist. When what that does, of course, is it doesn't inspire right-wing tough guys to cross the line and vote for Democratic women just because they're bloodthirsty. Like, that's not for Hillary Clinton. Republicans are going to vote for Hillary Clinton just because she promises to let blood. No. And then, but meanwhile, it convinces leftists to stay home. People who are progressives and socialists and others who might vote Democrat, they see these people running around with the Cheneys and the Kagans, and they say, forget it, and they don't show up, and they lose. But no matter how much, they lose 3-4 times in a row on this, right? And then they still do it. Watch, the next Democratic candidate is going to, whether man or woman, is going to be running on tough guy militarism, not like those sellout isolationists on the right. You know?
I love Ron Paul, and you mentioned him before. Like, how has this guy never gotten elected president? Like, is it just there's not enough power behind him, or there's too much power against him?
The real question is, how was he allowed to stay in the Congress all those years? And the answer to that is he's an obstetrician and delivered about a third of the population of his district, right? So they love him. They know him personally, and they really, and I shouldn't sell him short because that sounds like a cheat. That's not really true. I mean, the truth is he's just an absolutely wonderful guy. And the part about him being an obstetrician, it goes not just to him knowing his people, but it goes to him not being a lawyer. He's a doctor, and he's just a decent guy. He exudes sincerity and not hypocrisy, right? He's married to his high school sweetheart since they were 16. No scandals, right? Like, he's just a very decent, humble guy. And so people look at him and they go, wait a minute, this is too good to be true. And then they look into it and it's not too good to be true. His voting record proves that he meant what he said the whole time. I mean, direct answer to your question, it's just a matter of timing, right? When he ran for president in 88 as a libertarian, and boy, would we live in a different world if he had been in charge when the Cold War ended. But anyway, but he couldn't have run in 2000. I mean, he didn't have anything like the juice to run in 2000. And it was the governor of Texas, and the former president's son was already handpicked to take that spot. No question about that. And I think he really had to be convinced to run in 2008 by people who, might as well take a chance at it. And at the very least, you're going to be able to teach the American people about liberty. I
Yeah,
don't know
yeah.
how far he
What
thought it would
about,
go, but
what about for next election, making Thomas Massey libertarian? You run as his vice president, and then Elon puts the money in and backs that. I think that could
yeah.
work. I
Well,
mean,
I'm not the
who do you
guy.
like right now? Who do you like? Like who? And I
Yeah.
want to talk about Trump, and I want to talk a little bit about Israel because man, it's just a mess. But like, who do you like right now? Who's
Well, I
doing?
certainly like Massey. I don't know if he's going to run for president or not. I mean, I'd like to see him be Speaker of the House, quite frankly. He'd have the power of the purse then. It would be
That'd be
an
great.
extremely effective House Speaker if he could ever get that. It would take a real demand on the part of the population of Republican voters in the country to
Yeah,
make it that way. The leadership has absolutely zero interest whatsoever in
right.
rewarding him for his behavior, you know.
Yeah,
As far as the LP, I mean, first of all, I'm not that guy. I'll tell any candidate what they ought to be saying, but the LP ain't the vehicle. It's, you know, if, for actually running people for president to win, the Republican Party is the way to do it. And so there has to be this crack up of like, we have a population of people who lean much more toward Ron Paul and or Tucker Carlson, who are
yeah,
the voters of the Republican Party, but you have a Republican Party that's still run by George W. Bush types and, you
right.
know, at the top level. And so, and I mean, specifically in the House and the Senate, right? And the party itself, those guys are not grassroots MAGA folk. Those are GOP. They're all Mitch McConnell up there, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So there has to be a real change there, which is virtually impossible. I mean, that's how the system works is they make sure to keep all this stuff tamped down and keep the machine running at the top. So it'd be a hell of a fight, and naming names and telling the truth and having a good idea of who's on whose side up there is, you know, always a huge part of it. But then when it comes to the crucial things, people get betrayed pretty easily
They
by,
really
you
do,
know,
man. It's Game of Thrones. It really is Game of Thrones. So, I mean, what do you think is going on with Trump right now? Like, what is going through this guy's mind? Everything seems to be, every day he's coming out and seems like he's stabbing the people that support him in the back and calling his supporters stupid. And
it's
and
the
I know it's
combine, man.
all about
It's
Israel, right?
Yeah, it's a huge part of it, man, is Zionism. It's always been his major, you know, Achilles heel in his whole program. In the first campaign, the Israelis were really the only power faction that supported him. Right. He had some members of the Army and Marine Corps stand behind him, but even the Air Force and Navy wouldn't. But no, like organized, you know, real organized power faction would even support him except for the Israelis the first time around. And he did a little bit better the second, but he's just completely compromised by them. And it's, you know, it goes back to the complex because the Israelis are a huge part of that as well. They're worth about $4 billion in welfare to the military industries. You'll hear pro-Israelis say, oh, all that $4 billion a year, the American people are looted and forced to pay to Israel. Well, all that money goes straight back to American military defense firms. Yeah, well, I don't work for them and I don't have investments in them. So that's like saying, yeah, the national government stole my money and gave it right to Lockheed to build a weapon for the American Pentagon. That doesn't make me happy either. You know what I mean? And certainly not when we're talking about building weapons for foreign countries. That doesn't appease me whatsoever, but that'll be their talking point is that that's where that money's going. So, of course, you know, that means, again, the Israel lobby and the military industrial complex have their vanguard in the neoconservative movement, and they work very closely together to keep
I
all
have
of
to
that.
imagine the Israel lobby and the military industrial complex are kumbaya and
Yep,
probably
that's it.
pretty tight.
Yep, and the neocons are their vanguard. I mean, that's really what the neoconservative movement is their main political front. And so with Trump, look, he's taken hundreds of millions of dollars from Sheldon and Miriam Adelson and, you know, other important Zionists. And in his first term, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which is extremely important because that symbolizes, as they put it, that Jerusalem is always the undivided and eternal capital of Israel, meaning the eastern half of it can never be the capital of an independent Palestinian state. He recognized Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights in 67 and their annexation of it in 81. And then he did these so-called Abraham Accord peace deals, which is just bribing dictators in the region to normalize relations with Israel with American tax money
Right.
and and all the expense of the Palestinians, who they had always held out that when the Palestinians either get a two-state solution and independence or they get citizenship within a one-state situation, then we won't normalize relations with Israel. But then Jared Kushner just said, oh yeah, well, what's your price? The American people can afford it, and turned on the printing money machine and went over there and just bribed them off. And so This was a big part of what led to October 7th, was quite literally the Sunni kingdoms were forsaking the Palestinians. And Hamas said, no, you don't, not yet, right? And made one last gasp chance to essentially radicalize the situation and bring their situation back to promise. I mean, remember, all the attention had turned to Eastern Europe. And, there was, I don't know if you know this, but it's pretty funny that Jake Sullivan, who's Joe Biden's national security advisor, had just written in Foreign Affairs an article about the calm Middle East where we solved everything. And it was, the paper version was published before October 7th, like on October the 6th or something, right? And then they rewrote and edited the hell out of the online version where he had declared victory on all of these issues that were.
I remember Jeffrey Sachs talked about that. Man, it's just like, what's Israel's game? Like, is this Greater Israel Project? Are they really wanting to expand their borders so significantly into all this? Is that what it's all about? And then the other question is, I mean, what are your thoughts on Netanyahu? Is this guy a player in the game, or is he just the spokesperson messenger because he's such a good politician and been around for so long? Where does he fit into the chessboard?
Yeah, well, he's extremely important. He's the most powerful prime minister in Israeli history and longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. Yeah, no, he's not a sock puppet or a front for power behind the throne. He's the boss of the Israeli state for sure. And he is a harebrained schemer, right? I think he is ultimately extremely bad for Israel. And, what he's decided to do essentially is bite off more than they can chew and make them more enemies than they can handle and undermine the support that they need, especially in the United States, to be able to continue on. If they were smart at all, they would listen to their founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, after 67 said, we got to give up the West Bank and Gaza Strip. We can't take this territory because it comes with all these people and we don't want them. And what are we going to do with them? And it's going to ruin us if we have to enforce a military totalitarianism over these people for, unending decades, indefinite decades into the future. Forget it. And they ignored him and they decided to colonize all this land and keep all these people and hold them under this bondage for, of course, longer than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe, right? For decades. And since 1967, since 9 years before I was born. And like I said, I just turned 49. So these people, essentially, they live under not even martial law, but a foreign government's military occupation law, which is no law at all, right? Abduction and administrative detention without trial.
Like in Gaza and the West Bank, is the West, I always thought the West Bank was a little bit better, but, with all of the settlements and the lockdowns that seem to be happening there, it seems like the West Bank is no better than Gaza. Maybe it's not technically an open air prison, but it seems like it almost is.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the important point there is they don't even want the Gaza Strip. They want the West Bank. That's Judea and Samaria. Right.
Yeah.
Samaria. I always say it wrong. Samaria is different.
That's the crown jewel. And
that's right.
Really, maybe the Gaza stuff is just
warm up.
The press. It's a warm up. And in the meantime, they're expanding settlement by settlement by settlement. All right.
Don't get me wrong. I mean, they do want Gaza, but they're absolutely determined to take the West Bank. And in answer to your previous question about expanding their borders, yes, they've taken all the land up to the Litani River in southern Lebanon.
Yeah.
As I had warned for years, and experts on my show had warned for years, was in their interest, or what they wanted to do, not truly in their interest. They've moved into Syria and taken Mount Hermon and moved right up to the suburbs of Damascus. They're fighting in a war inside Syria right now on the side of the Druze, well, some Druze anyway. Fighting against Bedouins who are backed by the bin Ladenite government that they helped overthrow the country there back in December, which was, to spite the Shiites, they put bin Ladenites in there instead. And
didn't Al-Jilani just meet with Netanyahu and they're shaking hands and
with Trump?
Yeah,
I'm not sure if he met with Netanyahu or not, actually.
Trump. I was thinking Trump. You're right.
It was. And Trump said, this guy has a strong past. What does that mean? It means he fought Americans in Iraq War II. Right. In Mosul and Ramadi by his own confession.
Yeah.
And was leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria before ISIS split off from al-Nusra. And, al-Nusra and Jolani, they never denounced al-Qaeda. They just said, listen, for public relations reasons, we have to distance ourselves from them. But we thank them for understanding. And the al-Qaeda guys were like, yes, go with God. You have our blessing. We know you need to change your name. Because the game had changed.
Yeah.
America was backing them. So what the hell? We're going to go ahead and accept the empire's help for now. You know what I mean? It only made sense to.
Where's China these days in all of this? Are they just sitting back and just watching what happens? Like, if push came to shove with Iran, would China support Iran? Would China support Russia if it needed to, or no?
Well, look, I mean, China is very dependent on Iranian oil and other Middle Eastern oil. Whether they would go to war for some kind of short-term gain, in order to guarantee access to those resources for the long term, I don't know, like, what it would take to get them to freak out. If Trump, say, just started carpet bombing Tehran and, demanded the Ayatollah resign or tried to get a shot off and get him in a decapitation campaign and really push for a regime change in Tehran, would China intervene then? I tend to think not. Russia and China, of course, would be very much opposed to that.
Right.
Either of them be willing to go to war with the United States over Iran? I think probably not. For one, they're kind of competitors with the Russians. I mean, they're friends, but they're both oil exporters. And so, Russia is certainly not dependent on them for anything except some drones that they've helped with, but Russia's fine without them, really. And China can depend on Russia. If they have to, they can get all the oil and gas that they need from the Russians. And so something really bad happens to the Iranians from Beijing's point of view. You're really going to tangle with Washington over that? Probably not. They tend to, and this is not foolproof. I'm not saying, oh yeah, go ahead and stick your finger in the Chinese eye. They won't mind. I'm not saying that. I am saying, I'm not like rationalizing being imprudent. You know what I mean? You could cause problems, but I am saying they tend to have a lower time preference and tend to look at things in terms of like, how is this going to be in 50 years and 100 years in a way that Americans just do not. So I would like to think
they're very patient, man. They're very patient. They absolutely have that patience. All right, what do you think is next? What's the rest of this year look like? You think things are going to flare up again? Is Israel going to attack Iran again? You think there's more, situations there? Or what do you think? What do you think for the next 6 months?
Good question. I mean, I think the war in Gaza is going to keep going on. Trump says that he's found a peace deal or whatever. I think Hamas has been willing to deal, but Netanyahu doesn't want to deal. Netanyahu wants to cleanse those people out of there, and Trump's not going to stop him. So if Netanyahu digs in his heels, Trump's just going to drop it. And I think the same thing is true in Ukraine. I think Trump was sincere in wanting to end the war in Ukraine in a way where he doesn't give a damn about what's happening in Palestine. I think he did really want to end the Ukraine war, but he just can't. He just came into power at the wrong time, where the Russians are winning, but they're still far short of their goals. And so they're just not going to stop. In Ukraine, they're losing, but they're still far short of losing. And so they're not going to give up and walk away from territory that they still claim and stand on, right?
Yeah.
And so both sides still want to fight there. Now, Iran, we don't know exactly the degree to which their nuclear program has been set back, but it clearly was not obliterated. So the question is, I think we'll know a few weeks from now, where exactly does the Ayatollah stand on the future of the Iranian nuclear program? Is he really going to just fold it up and say, geez, I guess we just can't have one because you're going to bomb it? Or he's going to say, no way, nuts to you. We're just going to build a deeper tunnel under a taller mountain, and we're going to go back to enriching uranium as fast as we can. They know, they've proven that they've mastered the fuel cycle. They know how to enrich uranium. They know how to convert it to uranium hexafluoride gas and back again to metal and all of that. And so we destroyed their facility, but they surely can rebuild it if the Ayatollah chooses to. And I believe that he will. I think, I mean, it depends on just how back, if America is just virtually obliterated, as Trump said, everything of value in their program, and they really have to start from scratch, and they really believe that, well, if we do, America's just going to come back anyway. They're not going to let us get even close to where we were before they come and bomb us again. Then it would be rational on some level, assuming those circumstances, for them to just give it up. Bluff called. What are you going to do when America calls your bluff, man? You can't race to a bomb. We'll come back before you get there. So I don't know. On the other hand, we have every indication from semi-recent history here that they're not going to give in to these threats, and that the NPT, they kicked the inspectors out, but they're still officially within the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which guarantees their right to civilian nuclear technology. And they're, clearly want to have this for what it's worth, although not that much, a latent nuclear deterrent. I think they probably will not race to a bomb. They could. They're much more likely to race to a bomb now, but I think they're probably very likely to just keep plodding along on their civilian nuclear program, which Trump has insisted is over the line and that they're not allowed to have, whether they're actually making progress toward a weapon or not. And so now that he's drawn the line there, he's written us a prescription for a state of semi-permanent war, or air war at least, over Iran to prevent them from advancing this program. So there are a lot of people declaring victory here and saying that everyone who predicted disaster and cascading consequences were wrong. But I think that remains to be seen. That was what they said about Iraq War I, but we've been bombing Iraq for 34 years. And so,
crazy.
You know,
it really is this forever war, never ending. You know, it just, man, it's lining a lot of pockets. And I feel like those pockets will never let it stop. It's kind of like big pharma. You know, they don't want the world healthy. Yeah. They want the world sick. Good health, good health doesn't make any money. Well, listen, man, I don't want to keep you too much longer. This has been absolutely fantastic. I just have to tell you, keep doing what you're doing, man. You're one of a handful of voices that I think is really, really moving the needle and is really helping people honestly see the truth. I loved your episode on Tucker Carlson. I thought that was absolutely great. I've clipped up a bunch of those clips and put it on the Deep Shallow Dive socials and all of that stuff. But we just need to, like, I will say, I do think people are more awake now than they've ever been in this country. We were never political. The United States was never really cared. But from COVID to Russia, Ukraine to Gaza, I mean, I think the Israelis opened up Pandora's box with the way they've genocided Gaza, and it's not closing. It's not closing. And now people are going back to be like, hey, you know what? Let's take a look at 9/11. Let's really understand the dancing Israelis and, you know, Larry Silverstein. Why did he have double insurance on those buildings? What was that all about?
Look, you're right that everybody should be willing to question all of this stuff. And especially if you've been going along all this time, and it all seemed right to you up until you realized it wasn't, then yeah, stop and take a look. And, you know, at antiwar.com, we've been good on this stuff since 1995. We got everything that you need there from the whole time through. And so, you know, you can see behind me here, my books, Enough Already and Provoked, Enough Already on the Middle East and Provoked on the Russia stuff. The reason I know all this stuff is just because
Provoked is new.
Yeah, Provoked came out last November. Enough Already came out at the very beginning of 2021. And so they all are basically histories of the lead up to these conflicts and all the way through these conflicts. And so the only reason, you know, I'm not that smart or whatever. I've just been doing this job for a very long time in a row. And so the reason that I can fill you in on all the stuff you missed is because I didn't miss it. I've been at this since the turn of the century here. So, and before. So if you want to catch up, that's a couple of good places to start right there.
Yeah, well, you do a great job of communicating everything that we've all missed. So I really appreciate it. I'll put all the links for the books. Congrats on the new podcast with Daryl. I've listened to the first 3 episodes. I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of those. And I know that's doing well already.
By the way, anyway, #1 new podcast on Apple.
That's insane. Is it really?
Yeah. Not great.
You shoved Tucker and Joe Rogan out of the way. You're like, hey, listen.
Well, no. #1 new podcast.
Well, new podcast. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, that's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. I've really enjoyed the first 3 episodes. All right, listen, man, I might have to have you back another time if you're up for it. I really enjoyed it. All right. Listen, everybody. Hope you got as much out of this as I did. Scott Horton, he's got a new book, Provoked. He's got a new podcast, Provoked. I'll put everything in the show notes. And from now on, I'm sure you will recognize him on social because he's all over the place. Check out his recent interview with Tucker Carlson. That was absolutely fantastic. And we'll look forward to having Scott on again. All right, hold on the line a second. All right, everybody, call a spade a spade.
This episode was brought to you by Zippix nicotine toothpicks. Zip more, smoke less. Totally satisfying, discreet, and delicious. Zippix nicotine-infused toothpicks are available in 6 great flavors, each containing at least 2 milligrams of nicotine to curb those cravings. Zippix is FDA registered and proudly made in the USA. Use discount code DSD for 10% off your order at zippixtoothpicks.com. Zip more, smoke less, save 10%.